Let me sort of start a little more broadly and talk about the fact that we've called this time period in which we live right now the Anthropocene. And that is to denote the fact that it's increasingly human behavior, and in particular, human behavior related to energy use, energy technologies, that is increasingly shaping our environment, our natural environment, and our social environment. The leading assumption behind decisions that get made in the space until very recently has been one of rational choice almost exclusively. Instead, of course, we know in psychology and even increasingly in economics, that sort of we certainly have the capacity to be rational, and that rational processes are one of the decision modes, which evolution has equipped us with. And that we don't share with too many other animals. But at the same time, we also make decisions based on our feelings, not just with our heads, but with our hearts, positive and negative ones, and oftentimes by the book, following rules, rules of conduct, whether they're moral rules of conduct or standard operating procedures in organizations. And in general, that's sort of we oftentimes use these rules of conduct or other shortcuts because we only have bounded rationality. We have only so much processing capacity, only so much attention. Because it's finite, attention is finite, we have to husband it carefully. And therefore, we oftentimes apply it to the here and now because sort of if we're not around tomorrow, you don't have to do any long-term planning. But in our current technological environment, we just have to also pay attention to longer-term goals and to longer-term risks. And so I oftentimes think, as much as I've been talking that rational choice isn't our primary, maybe even processing capacity, I wished we were more rational. We wouldn't be in the problem that we're in. So let's talk about bounded rationality. So bounded rationality basically implies selective attention, as I already indicated. And so therefore, now we as psychologists have been looking at variations in attention as a function of prior history, chronic effects, individual differences oftentimes, or physical and social environments that we find ourselves in other words, situational effects. The most prominent theory in that space has been prospect theory. Daniel Kahneman got the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for that in 2002. Its big innovation relative to expected utility theory has been this notion of reference points. Nothing is good or bad; it's always compared to what. And you can change the perception of something by changing the reference points. Query theory, which is the topic of the next 45 minutes, is not a competitor to prospect theory. In some sense, it's sort of the next level down psychological process theory that explains why the functional relationships that describe prospect theory, risk-taking in the domain of gains, risk-averse in the risk-taking in the domain of losses, risk-taking in the domain of gains, loss aversion, why those functional regularities actually occur and how they occur by reference to attentional processes, by reference to memory processes. And so query theory explains a broad range of sort of what the economists call choice anomalies, in other words, phenomena that exist that they can't explain with rational choice models. Okay? And they go from loss aversion to status quo bias to effects of social norms and so on. But query theory explains all of the ones that prospect theory describes plus additional ones. Okay? So what is query theory? It's basically a theory that describes how we go about making judgments, how we go about making decisions. Would you rather have option A or option B? It assumes that sort of you basically send automatic implicit queries to your prior experience with the world, everything that you ever sort of experienced, like an LLM. So you send a query and saying, okay, what's good about option A? Okay. Then you sort of count, okay, this much is good for option A. Then you say, okay, what's good about option B? And whatever sort of has the larger balance of arguments, that's the one you go with. Sounds pretty good so far. Okay. Queries are issued sequentially due to bounded rationality. We can only do so much at a time. And there I want to just sort of take a visual analogy. Many of you have seen in Psych 101 these reversible figures. If you take white as a foreground, you see a candlestick. If you take black as a foreground, you see two children looking at each other. You certainly can switch back and forth between those two percepts, and I encourage you to do that. You can't see them both at the same time. Yeah? And so that is also then the idea behind query theory. Because of finite information processing capacity, we sort of query one thing at a time. And then you say, well, as long as we sort of query both of them, that should be okay. Well, here's sort of the sticker that makes query theory what it is. All other things being equal, whichever option you consider first has a sizable advantage. It gets a query theory bump. And why is that? Because as you think about what's good about $50 right away, you temporarily inhibit all arguments for all response competitors, for option B, C, and D. As you then, a split second later, turn to what's good about B or what's good about C, those arguments, because you just temporarily inhibited them, have a harder time coming to the surface. So all other things being equal, the initial focus of attention is sort of, in some sense, is the million-dollar question. That not deterministic, obviously, but noticeably sort of superior. So let's start with a phenomenon. And in particular, excessive discounting of future costs and benefits. We see this at individual level, sort of in terms of subprime mortgages, that got us into the financial crisis 20 years ago, insufficient pension savings, smoking, obesity, basically sort of costs that are incurred right now loom large, and benefits that come down the road sort of get discounted and not sufficient weight. You also see it at the societal, at the political level, the struggle, for example, of sustainable development to make progress, because again, the financial or the inconvenience to lifestyle decisions, negative consequences are right now upfront, and then the benefits are sort of highly questionable and dispersed in time and get discounted. So, of course, as a psychologist, we want to do this systematically. We simplify, we take it into the lab. And the simplest sort of way to look at intertemporal choice is to have a sooner, smaller reward on the left-hand side and a larger, later reward on the right-hand side. And you don't want to know what kind of discount rate that is, but most people like the one on the left. Certainly no discount rate that economists would endorse. So we know people are impatient, they discount too much. We also know, since George Lowenstein established the phenomenon first in 1988, that people actually are much less impatient when you make the future option the default and you say, okay, you're assigned to get sort of the larger later reward. But if you want to, you can switch to the sooner, smaller reward. Of course, you would get less. So the delay condition is the one that we mostly operate in this world, where sort of immediate gratification seems to be the norm, and we can delay sort of things to the future. But sometimes, when it comes to shipping, for example, the default might be shipping in 3 days' time. But if you want to get sort of your new iPhone tomorrow, or even within the next 2 hours, you can pay a little extra for that. And of course, sort of to keep things sort of rational, it shouldn't make a difference, like whether your focus of attention is on one option or the other, because the costs and benefits to both options are exactly the same, regardless of your initial focus of attention, right? So again, in the lab now, we give people options like this under delay condition, where the immediate consumption is the default, indicated by a larger font, by the green triangle underneath, and also telling them they're assigned to get this, or the larger later is the default. And the first one we call delay, and this one we call the acceleration condition. So let me show you an experiment that now is trying to, first of all, replicate the Lowenstein result, and then explain it with query theory processes. Okay? So this is a typical online experiment where we have a broad range of ages and incomes and genders and so on. And also for the economists, it's consequential. So 1 in 100 actually gets the option that they chose. And we take the risk out of it. Even if you chose the larger later reward, you get your Amazon gift certificate in the email today. You just can't use it until whatever, 45 days from now. Mm-hmm. So in addition to giving people the choice in one condition or the other between subjects, we also now have our query theory experimental procedure. It's online. Okay? So we say, okay, you have this let's say in the accelerator condition, this choice is ahead of you. But now tell us, sort of by typing out loud, what goes through your mind as you make this decision. And we pre-train them to have like a few, list a few reasons. So you know, I'll show you in a second how many they list. Then they make their decision, and then afterwards we show them the fragments that they generated, sort of one reason at a time. We ask them to indicate, is this an argument for the sooner smaller reward, for the larger later reward, for both or for neither? Okay, and so then we can sort of see in their list of arguments that they generate, and they generate between sort of 2 and 5 or 6 or 7 of them. First of all, do they cluster? Remember, query theory sort of says, well, you focus on one thought, one option at a time. Yeah? If you focus on one option at a time, then the arguments should cluster. They shouldn't be randomly interspersed. Yeah? Arguments for choosing the sooner, smaller, or the larger, later. Also, depending on what condition you're in, and our assumption was that, you know, sort of if something is the default option, you first think about what's good about the default option. Yeah? Because the default option is recommended by the experimenter somehow. It's also, as I said, it has a green triangle, it has a larger font. It's on the left-hand side, and our reading order is left to right. So all of these reasons should say, well, I shall look at the default option first. So not only are these arguments that people generate clustered, but do the clusters follow what query theory would predict you should focus on first. Yeah? And then, as we said, you know, whatever you cluster, whatever you focus on first, that option is not inhibited in its argument. So there should be more arguments for the option that you looked at first and fewer arguments for the option that you looked at second. Okay? So here's like an example of the thought listing that somebody in the acceleration condition gave. So you see, I don't need the money now. Good things come to those who wait, but I hate waiting. I could get that new book that Karen mentioned. Yeah? And so what we then do is we can look at what we call the SMERT index, the standardized median rank difference. We look at the ranks of arguments, in this case for waiting. And this is a person in the acceleration condition where waiting was the default option. And so the first one is for waiting, the second one is for waiting. So those two have ranks of 1 and 2, and so the median rank for that is 1.5. And then the median for the other two is 3.5. It's a SMERT index of -2. In other words, it's nicely clustered, and the sooner smaller comes second, or the larger later comes first. Okay. And so what do we find? First of all, we do replicate Lowenstein, 1988. What I'm plotting here is the discount factor. It's the amount of money that you're willing to settle for right now for $1 in a year's time. Okay? In other words, the smaller bars means that you're discounting more, you're more impatient. And the people in the delay condition are, again, very impatient. $1 in a year's time is only worth 34 cents to them today. Acceleration is 57 cents, so they're less impatient in the acceleration condition. Let's look at the SMERT index first. So in this, positive bars means that the people are looking first at sooner, smaller rewards, and they do that in the delay condition. The significantly different from 0. They're not randomly interspersed, but in the delay condition, sooner, smaller arguments come first, and in acceleration, larger later come first. And as a result of that, also we see that in the delay condition, where sooner, smaller arguments come first, we have more of them, more impatient aspects in that condition. And then in combination, you also should see whether or not the SMERT index, which of course differs between individuals. You know, some people actually do produce, you know, sort of randomly interspersed arguments, but by and large, people don't, you know, because we saw the means. But you know, the SMERT index of an individual and the proportion of impatient aspects for that individual should be correlated, pretty strongly correlated according to query theory, and they are, 0.65, and that is very typical in query theory studies. We combine them into a single factor, and then in combination, they actually predict the differences in people's preferences. Sometimes we have partial mediation, sometimes we have complete mediation, but always a strong partial mediation. Okay, so now you're telling me, well, it's interesting, sort of correlationally, these results predict that, but let's turn correlations into causation. If indeed it's the order in which people generate arguments, we should be able to intervene in this automatic process, and people in the delay condition who, under the natural order, the one I just showed you, where I didn't prompt a particular order, just let them generate as any way they wanted, but they first generate arguments for now and then for later. in experiment 2, now we tell people in the delay condition, half of them, nothing about natural and unnatural order, but just half of them get told, first generate arguments for why you want the sooner, smaller reward, and then the larger, later reward. Or we do it in the unnatural order, and the opposite, for people in the acceleration condition. And if that's the case, if the order in which they now explicitly generate one or the other with a Smirt index of +1 or -1, right, explicitly, that then should translate into differences in choice. And first of all, we see that yes, it does. In the natural condition, people are again much more impatient for the delay condition on the left. In fact, more so, and they should be more so because now the Smirt index is +or -1, right? But if we then intervene with the natural process by asking them to do it explicitly in the unnatural order, the difference becomes not significant. Notice it doesn't reverse, and I think it doesn't reverse because the automatic way of doing it in the natural way is still there. It's just being sort of counteracted by sort of explicitly doing it in the unnatural way. And so these things sort of cancel each other out, if you will. Okay. What else? What other evidence could we have for query theory that sort of gets at the underlying process of inhibiting arguments for all other response competitors as you consider the first option? And I call this the third experiment sometimes my cloud chamber metaphor, because just as you can't see subnuclear particles sort of with your eyes, but you can see the paths they leave behind as they pass through a cloud chamber. You can also can't see inhibition in the brain, but you can see the consequences that inhibition has. Yeah? And so in the third experiment, we gave people exactly the same stimuli that you saw in experiments 1 and 2, but now there's no thought listing procedure. They just get acceleration versus delay condition for the intertemporal choice. They make their decision, and then we say, oh, just wait a second, you just did this experiment. And last week we had some people in the lab who did your experiment, but they provided some arguments for that choice. And we're going to show you some of those arguments. And also we're going to show you arguments from another study that actually looked at sort of, was an endowment effect study on buying and selling coffee mugs. We don't even say anything about that. We say there was also another study. We're going to show you now arguments like I don't need the money now, or I can use it to buy something new, or the mug is dusty. And you should tell us as quickly as possible as you can, is this an argument from your study or from another study? Okay. Accuracy in the task is high, 97%, and it doesn't differ by condition, and so we can actually now look at people's accuracy. There's no speed accuracy trade-offs there, and the question is, are people faster at verifying an argument that comes from their study that is from the condition that they considered first? And yes, indeed. First of all, it's useful to see that for the foils, there's no difference in response time. Yeah, so the mug is dusty, gets verified by the same speed, regardless of whether you're in the acceleration or delay condition. But as you can see, you have a crossover interaction that for people in the delay condition, they are faster of verifying for now arguments than the opposite. So I think sort of for now we've sort of seen that the basic assumptions of query theory certainly seem to hold in this context and explain the differences in people's choice uptake. Let's look at another sort of neuroscience evidence for the reality. That's sort of showing the same two options, but with a different attentional focus, either on now or on later, makes a difference in terms of information processing. And so we basically put people now into a scanner and scan their responses, sort of in the acceleration with the delay condition. And we basically find that there's no brain area that's more active during the acceleration condition than the other one, but there are brain areas that are more active during the delay condition, where immediate consumption is the initial focus of attention. Immediate consumption has, when you look at the arguments that people rate, immediate consumption has much more vivid, much more non-abstract sort of arguments. People talk about all the wonderful things they can do with the money, whereas sort of waiting later sort of oftentimes means I'm going to save that, or I'm going to put it away to the side. And so it makes sense that in those areas that are responsible for storing memories about sort of immediate consumption consequences, there's more activation in one condition than the other condition. So what are our general conclusions so far? Preferences, what we want, the sooner, smaller, or the larger, later reward, very much depend on the focus of attention, and that arguments for the choice default get considered first. And that surely is sort of one of the many reasons that we have for the pervasive status quo bias that we see in so many domains. Yeah? Status quo being something that either it's a behavioral status quo, you've been doing something for a while, and you had some good reason for it in the first place. Why wouldn't you first think about sort of what's good about that option? Hasn't killed you yet, it can't be all that dangerous, right? Or if it's a recommended default, like not being an organ donor unless you indicate otherwise in Germany, or being an organ donor unless you indicate otherwise in Austria, sort of presumably sort of your government has your best interest in mind. So why wouldn't you think about the recommended course first? Since the early 2000s, when we've been running sort of studies about query theory, lots of other people have been doing it as well. And so we did recently a meta-analysis of all the published studies at the time. Comes from lots of different domains. Intertemporal choice, I showed you an example, but also risky choice, framing things as gains versus losses, for example, the Asian disease problem, and also multi-attribute choice, sort of calling minced meat either 80% lean or 20% fat, these kinds of manipulations. So they're from different domains, and we can look at sort of the overall effect of query order in these studies. Is query order affected by the decision frame, sort of being in the gain or loss, or acceleration of the delay condition, and even adjusted for publication bias. It's a sort of smallish to medium size effect size, but it's pretty consistent across the continuum. And even more importantly, study 2 that I showed you, where we now intervene and ask people to explicitly do it in one order, the natural order or the unnatural order. What's the effect of that natural versus unnatural order assignment? And there the overall difference, precision-weighted difference is 0.55 in terms of Cohen's d. Okay? So makes a big difference across different domains. Okay, let's get back to attention. Yeah. So query theory basically sort of seems to be driven by different attentional foci in different conditions. In conditions where sort of ostensibly it shouldn't make a difference, sort of how you focus attention according to rational choice, but it does anyway. And so let's look at sort of situations where sort of the effects of initial attention are either chronic as a function of your prior history, or situational as a function of sort of the context in which the question is being asked. And so as we talk about sort of attention, let's say even in the temporal domain, to sooner, smaller, larger, later rewards, immediate consumption is something that we sort of do natural. I mean, and you have to have a lot of self-control to oftentimes override immediate consumption. We all want to have that one marshmallow now, but we learn to wait for the second marshmallow in 20 minutes. So there are clinical conditions where people sort of overlearned control, in situations where sort of some traumatic event sort of oftentimes early on in life sort of had made you realize that you're out of control. You try to compensate for that. Eating disorders are one such example, and then also obsessive compulsive personality disorders. And turns out when we're talking about anorexia nervosa, there are actually 2 types of anorexics. The ones who basically eat and then purge, and the ones who constrain consumption. Now, eating and purging, you don't need self-control, but sort of basically controlling intake requires a tremendous amount of self-control. And so we were curious to see whether or not, first of all, how do anorexics in these 2 conditions do in an intertemporal choice task, the one I just showed you, for money. Okay, for money, we thought maybe sort of we don't see an effect of the disorder in the money condition. We might have to go to food rewards to see it. But turns out that we actually did see it, even with the monetary rewards. It really spills over. This strong ability to self-control spills over into the monetary choice. But interestingly, and so basically the healthy controls are the white ones, the anorexics who are binging and purging, who essentially look like the normals, but the ones who are controlling food intake are the ones who also control a sort of desire for immediate consumption. But interestingly enough, the pattern of acceleration being more patient than delay condition is true for them as well. And so the query theory processes are still operating even in individuals who have a much higher sort of general level of self-control, but there's enough room to take that sort of the condition makes a difference. And you get the same pattern for obsessive-compulsive disorders. There's a difference between obsessive-compulsive disorder and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. And it's a personality disorder that sort of has a higher degree of self-control. And you see exactly the same pattern. There's a main effect of being in that clinical condition, but the query theory difference between natural versus unnatural order, or being in the acceleration versus delay condition, is exactly the same for them. So basically, individual chronic differences in self-control make a difference, but the focus of attention, which of course is situational, sort of still plays a role. So what other situational effects do we have that tell us something about query theory processes? A number of years ago, I gave a sort of like an early version of this talk at Harvard in Jen Lerner's lab, and she had just done a study on sort of sad people basically going out to buy stuff. You feel sad in Western cultures, you fill up your sadness with stuff. And she was telling me about the study, and she says, well, let's wait a second. If you're sad and you need stuff, you need money. So let's do our intertemporal choice task with people who either are sad or not, and something else, and see whether they are more impatient. That would be a situational variable, right? You're sad, you need money. Okay, immediate consumption. So we put people into a sad or neutral or disgusting condition by having them watch video clips, and we verified this was like a 20-minute video clip. I think Trainspotting was a disgust, and sad was, I forget what the movie was, but neutral was like a National Geographic one. And basically sort of find that indeed people in the sad, now we're again plotting the discount factor, and so lower bars means that people are more impatient, and sure enough, the sad condition was the one that was significantly more impatient relative to the other two conditions. And if you look at the SMERT index, again, sort of the immediate consumption arguments, shot up, clustering very strongly at the beginning relative to the other two conditions. And the number of impatient thoughts was higher for the sad condition. So I mean, every sort of confirmed query theory processes at work, even in this context. And then in combination, there's a SMERT and the proportion of impatient aspects. Again, in this case, I think completely moderated mediated the difference in discount factor as a function of mood people were in. So query order in many ways is the $1,000,000 question if you're trying to sort of change people's preferences in some way. We talked about status quo bias, that you first think about the option, arguments for the option that is a status quo in some sense. We talked about emotional state. We just did a study on social norm information. Social norm information has many ways of influencing decisions, but one of the ways it influences decisions is by sort of making the norm consistent argument, sort of the one that people consider first. So if I tell you that 85% of people are sort of voted in favor of this environmental policy, people will first think about what's good about the policy and then what's bad about it. And if I tell them that only 30%, or 15% voted for this initiative, they first think about what's bad about it and then what's good about it. What other things determine the order of option consideration? Well, I already sort of indirectly talked about reading order. So if you do a study in a Western context, sort of in the United States, people will first look at the left option. If it's in China, it might be top or bottom, or Israeli, it's the other way. So reading order, our habitual way of looking at things. Also, when it comes to polling, I'm not sure how ballots look in Germany, but in the United States, they tend to be sort of by row, like a row is a candidate, and you sort of you walk down the row. Turns out that 16 states in the United States randomly assign candidates to the different positions. And it makes a sizable difference depending on sort of what, especially on certain kind of issues where you're listed on the ballot. So that's certainly another sort of more situational and non-obvious way in which our judgments are influenced by query order processes. Turns out that actually Florida didn't randomly assign order, and they put George W. Bush as first because his brother made the decision who's going to list it first. Yeah, so the world would look different if that had been different. But also initial emotional reactions, whether or not an option has a label or an image that either attracts you or repels you makes a difference. And let me just show you one sort of other study along those lines. This was a number of years ago. We asked people whether they're willing to pay for a carbon user fee. And the carbon user fee was either called a carbon tax or a carbon offset between subjects. There were like 2 pages of text that came from sort of the literature on carbon offsets that the airlines put out. That was exactly the same between the 2 conditions. It was just like one word, and we called the study the dirty word or dirty world. The question is, do you pick the one that has the inclusive ticket with the carbon user fee, which is either offset or tax, or just a regular ticket? When it's called an offset, it doesn't matter who you are, Democrat, Independent, or Republican, which we asked afterwards, demographics. About 62% sort of takes the inclusive ticket, pays the extra money for that. But if it's called a tax, it doesn't matter for the Democrats, but for Republicans it goes down to 27%. Okay? And so the question is, can we actually sort of now explain this with query theory processes? And so our participants listed something like 2.7 thoughts at a time. There was no difference between parties, or the frame that they saw things in, and how many options they listed. But we can again look at the SMIRT index. You can sort of see the pattern of the SMIRT index looks a lot like the pattern of the results, and also the result of the frequency of thoughts. If you put those 2 together, again, sort of those 2 query theory process measures, in this case, completely mediate the differences in choice. We had also a study 2, in this case, where we asked people to now list arguments in the unnatural order. And people basically follow orders right from the experimenter, right? We are obedient creatures. Well, I think almost half of the Republicans in the study did not follow instructions to first list arguments for the carbon tax. Those who followed instructions actually showed the reduced sort of effect, but basically they refused to do that because so the natural order is just so strongly ingrained because of the emotional response to the word tax, especially carbon tax. Okay, so in terms of general conclusions, query theory describes the process of sequential argument generation. It unifies a lot of puzzling phenomena in judgment and decision making. Those anomalies, sort of I mentioned earlier. It provides an investigative process tracing tool to explore different process explanations, and it could be sort of applied to other settings as well. And the first option considered has a great advantage. So let me sort of end by saying nothing is ever new under the sun. So when we talk about sort of argument generation, people said, well, remember Benjamin Franklin's sort of calculus sort of for moral algebra and how to make decisions. And you've probably seen this in different papers, sort of in the affairs of so much importance. How do you sort of make an important decision? Well, you divide half of a sheet of paper by line and 2 columns, and you have pros and cons, and then you write down the pros and cons. And then sort of depending on sort of which side comes out with more pros, that's the one you chose. Sort of at the time, people talked about sort of making marriage decisions based on that. So it's a well-known quote. But notice that when you look at these things, there's always like a dot. So my co-author on this and my husband, Eric Johnson, went to the library, or probably just Googled it. and find out what are the dots. And it says when those difficult cases occur, when you can't quite make up your mind, they are difficult chiefly because while we have them under consideration, all the reasons pro and con are not present to the mind at the same time. But sometimes one set presents themselves, and other times another, the first being out of sight. Okay? Hence the various purposes or inclinations that alternately prevail and the uncertainty that perplexes us. And then to get over this, that's why sort of he developed this calculus. Yeah? And so here's the first part of query theory, which is that you can't think about both at the time, that one in some sense includes the other. He didn't necessarily sort of have the idea about inhibition, yeah, and how to get around it, but his conclusion was not so different. Basically saying that in a given situation, it might be one that is your focus of attention, or the other one of that. So don't sort of basically sort of make a decision right away. Just wait and let this different situational contexts balance each other out until you have a more fair distribution of arguments. So, what are the theoretical implications of query theory? Well, I think sort of there's a lot of work right now on drift diffusion models as ways of explaining information decisions that sort of require the acquisition of information. Oftentimes they're about external information, but the same applies for internal information, of course. And they all make the assumption, and it's a mathematically simplifying assumptions, that arguments are randomly considered and integrated into the drift diffusion. And then you cross one challenge and you go with A, or the other barrier and you go with B. I think query theory makes a pretty convincing argument that that's not a good empirical assumption. It might be good mathematical, it's not good empirically. So we should definitely investigate other assumptions. And it's pretty clear that the inhibition of response competitor arguments during the first option evaluation really sort of generates a Markov chain type of process, where sort of you stay within the same category until by chance you get sort of kicked over into the other one. Practical implications? Well, being aware of query theory processes is a way of helping yourself, sort of arrive at better decisions. Become aware of the internal or external environmental influences on initial attention. Question why somebody's presenting you options in a certain way with a certain default, for example, or with bright, shiny objects next to one option. Yeah? That's why we have advertising, right? Putting bright, shiny objects next to the stuff you want to sell. And question sort of motives for and consequences of that natural implicit query or that somebody is trying to sell you on. We have a good friend who's in a different area, but she heard about query theory a few years ago, and she's a bit of a shopaholic. And so we saw her 2 or 3 years later, and she said, "Oh, you have no idea how much money you've saved me over the last couple of years, because whenever I see something now that I want, I first ask myself, why don't I need this?" So by the same token, sort of rather than helping yourself, you also can help others to align their goals with the query theory processes. And I was saying this to a couple of people earlier. It's never quite clear to me why paternalism or maternalism has become a dirty word, because I think there's sort of lots of good reasons why sort of we oftentimes can help other people make better decisions. So with that, I thank you for your scarce attention.